All right, so today we're going deep into the age of Jackson, something I know you've mentioned being really interested in.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and we're using this Wondery podcast episode as our source material, which,
It's good.
yeah, and it really does read like a historical drama. You know, we're
Uh-huh.
talking Manifest Destiny, Westward Expansion, the whole shebang.
hmm
But we're trying to go beyond the usual, kind of heroic narrative.
Yeah, I think that's key. This deep dive is really about understanding all the complexities of westward expansion and all the human stories, the triumphs and tragedies that shaped this whole era.
Exactly. We're talking things like the Donner Party,
Right.
the Bear Flag Revolt, these stories that, really show the grit and at times just utter chaos of this period.
Yeah, and of course, looming over all of this is this issue of slavery, which becomes even more, heated as America expands. And I think that's where this source material is so valuable because it really doesn't shy away from some of the darker aspects of this period.
No.
It really grapples with how this seemingly positive idea of spreading American ideals, Manifest Destiny actually had some deeply troubling consequences.
Yeah, so the episode starts with Andrew Jackson on his deathbed
Yeah.
at the Hermitage in 1845.
Wow.
Talk about setting the stage.
Yeah.
What are your initial thoughts on how the episode portrays his death and his legacy?
Well, it's such a powerful opening. It really throws you right into this pivotal moment in American history. Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, the champion of the common man, is gone. And there's this sense of, what's next for America without this towering figure at the helm.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because Jackson is so often seen as this symbol of American strength and expansionism.
Yeah.
But as the episode points out, his legacy is much more complicated than that. I mean, he was a slave owner, a proponent of Indian removal. He
Wow.
embodies, both the aspirations and the contradictions of this era.
Absolutely. And his death creates this void in American politics.
Yeah.
It opens the door for new leaders to emerge who will then grapple with, the challenges and the divisions that Jackson left behind.
And speaking of new leaders, enter James K. Polk,
Right.
elected in 1844. He's a staunch expansionist,
Yep.
much like Jackson. What strikes you about Polk's approach to westward expansion, particularly as it relates to Manifest Destiny?
Well, I think Polk really takes that idea of manifest destiny and runs with it.
Mm-hmm.
He believes it's America's God-given right to expand across the continent, and he's not afraid to use military force to achieve that goal.
Mm-hmm.
His sights are set on Oregon and California, both claimed by other nations at the time,
Right.
and this really sets the stage for conflict, particularly with Mexico.
And while all the political wheels are turning in Washington,
Yeah.
thousands of Americans are heading west,
Yeah.
lured by the promise of cheap land and a fresh start. The episode does a great job of really conveying the excitement and the hardship
Yeah.
of this mass migration.
Hmm.
It really makes you think about the risks these pioneers were willing to take.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by the story of the Donner Party,
Right.
which the episode uses as a cautionary tale about the perils of westward migration.
Yeah.
Their decision to take a shortcut based on a faulty guidebook led to them being trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains during this brutal winter.
It's a chilling reminder that, the journey west was anything but easy,
Right.
and it highlights this role of misinformation and how it can have these devastating consequences.
Right. The Donner Party story is a stark reminder of the human cost of westward expansion. It's a powerful counterpoint to this often romanticized narrative of manifest destiny.
Absolutely. And while the Donner Party faced the unforgiving wilderness,
Mm-hmm.
another drama was unfolding in Texas. The U.S. annexation of Texas in 1845 infuriates Mexico, which still considered Texas its territory. This annexation really throws fuel on the fire of this already tense relationship between the two countries.
And Polk doesn't shy away from confrontation.
Right.
He sends General Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande, essentially daring Mexico to respond.
Which, of course, they do, and that leads to the Thornton Affair,
Right.
a skirmish between U.S. and Mexican troops that gives Polk the pretext he needs to declare war.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on how the episode portrays Polk's role in escalating tensions with Mexico?
Well, the episode makes it clear that Polk was looking for a reason to go to war with Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
He believed that war was necessary to acquire the territories he wanted, including California and the Thornton Affair, while tragic played right into his hands. He used it to portray Mexico as the aggressor and rally support for war.
It's interesting, isn't it, how a relatively minor incident like the Thornton Affair can become a catalyst for a major conflict.
Right.
It makes you wonder about the role of chance and contingency in history.
It certainly does, and it raises questions about Polk's motives.
Mm-hmm.
Was he truly concerned about protecting American interests, or was he simply using the Thornton Affair as an excuse to achieve his expansionist goals?
Yeah, I think that's a question worth pondering. And it speaks to the complexities of this period.
Right.
It's not always this, clear-cut case of good guys versus bad guys.
Right.
There are shades of gray, and understanding those nuances is crucial to understanding the full story of Manifest Destiny.
I agree, and as we delve deeper into this episode, we'll see how these complexities play out in California, where another conflict is about to erupt.
Oh, boy. So while this war with Mexico is brewing, there's already this tension kind of simmering in California. The episode talks about how many Americans living there were getting restless under Mexican rule.
Yeah, and it's important to note that, many of these Americans were actually encouraged by U.S. agents to stir up trouble. They saw California as this valuable prize, ripe for the taking.
Right. And that's where John C. Fremont enters the picture, right? The explorer who later becomes a presidential candidate.
That's right. In 1846, he's leading an expedition in California, and he starts encouraging American settlers to challenge Mexican authority.
So it seems like there were a lot of really powerful figures with their own agendas all converging on California at this time. What was it about California that made it such a desirable territory?
Well, California held this really strategic position on the Pacific coast, which offered access to trade routes with Asia. It was also known to have fertile land and vast natural resources,
Right.
all of which fueled American ambitions.
And those ambitions boil over in what the episode calls the Bear Flag Revolt.
Mhm.
I have to admit, even knowing a little bit about this period, the details of this revolt are just wild.
It is such a strange and fascinating episode.
Yeah.
This small group of American settlers feeling threatened by Mexican authorities decide they're going to take matters into their own hands.
What?
They kidnap a Mexican official, raise this homemade flag with a grizzly bear on it,
Talk about a symbol.
talk about a symbol,
Yeah.
and declare California an independent republic.
It sounds almost comical, but I imagine it was a very tense and dangerous situation for everyone involved.
Absolutely, and I think the episode captures that mix of, bravado and fear that must have been present among these settlers.
Right.
They were risking everything on this bold and some might say reckless move.
And then they celebrate their independence with a fandango,
Mm.
this traditional Spanish dance. It's just such a bizarre and unexpected detail.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
I think it speaks to, this melting pot of cultures that was already present in California at the time. You have Spanish, Mexican, Native American, and American influences all kind of colliding. And
Right.
in a way, the Bear Flag Revolt, with its mix of, American ambition and Spanish festivity, it embodies that cultural clash.
It's a reminder that history is full of these strange contradictions and unexpected moments.
And while the Bear Flag Republic was short-lived, lasting less than a month,
Mm.
it's a really symbolic moment that captures the spirit of the times. It really highlights the lawlessness of the frontier, the boldness of American expansionism, and, this willingness to use force to achieve those goals.
So the U.S. Navy arrives in California, takes control, and the Bear Flag Revolt fizzles out.
Right.
But back in Texas, the war with Mexico is raging on what happens on that front.
Well, the war continues for about 2 years, with the U.S. ultimately emerging victorious.
Right.
In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed, officially ending the war.
And this treaty leads to the U.S. acquiring a massive amount of territory from Mexico, right?
Yes, a vast territory that includes California, New Mexico, and parts of what are now Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and Colorado.
Wow.
With this treaty, the United States achieves its goal of expanding from coast to coast. Manifest Destiny becomes a reality, at least geographically.
But as the episode makes clear, this victory comes at a cost. It also opens up a whole new can of worms when it comes to the issue of slavery. All this new land will be free or slave territory.
That becomes the question that dominates American politics for the next decade leading up to the Civil War.
And it's in this context that we see the emergence of the Wilmot Proviso. Tell me more about that. What was it and what was its significance?
So the Wilmot Proviso, proposed in 1846 by Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, was an attempt to ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. It was a bold move, and it immediately sparked this firestorm of debate in Congress.
It's amazing to think that even as the U.S. is celebrating its territorial expansion,
Yeah.
the nation is already so deeply divided over what to do with this new land.
Exactly. And I think the Wilmot Proviso really throws that division into sharp relief. It shows just how deeply entrenched the issue of slavery had become in American politics. And it foreshadows, these even greater conflicts to come.
So ultimately, the Wilmot Proviso fails to pass, but it's a significant moment nonetheless, right?
Absolutely. Even though it was defeated, the fact that it was even proposed showed that there was this growing movement opposed to the expansion of slavery.
Right.
It emboldened abolitionists, and it laid the groundwork for future anti-slavery efforts.
It's interesting how this episode highlights both the unifying and dividing forces at work in this period. You have this sense of national pride and accomplishment with westward expansion, but also these deep-seated tensions that are threatening to tear the nation apart.
Right, and it's in this tumultuous environment that a new political party emerges, the Free Soil Party.
Okay.
Now, they weren't necessarily abolitionists, but they were vehemently opposed to the expansion of slavery into the new territories.
So the episode frames them as kind of a precursor to the Republican Party, right?
Yeah.
Appealing to those who wanted to, build a life for themselves out west without the competition of slave labor.
Exactly. They were this mix of former Whigs, Democrats, and abolitionists, all united by this common goal of preventing the spread of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And while they weren't immediately successful in winning elections, they did play a significant role in shaping the political landscape.
So we have the Mexican War ending the slavery question, becoming even more heated,
Right.
and these new political factions emerging. It feels like the ground is shifting under America's feet.
It is a period of rapid change and uncertainty.
Yep.
And it sets the stage for the 1848 presidential election, where we see the existing party system beginning to crumble under the weight of the slavery debate.
And it's in that election that Zachary Taylor, a war hero with no clear stance on slavery, emerges as a somewhat surprising victor.
Right.
What can you tell us about his rise to the presidency?
Well, Taylor was a Whig candidate, but he was also popular among some Democrats who were dissatisfied with their own party's stance on slavery.
Mm-hmm. And the Free Soil Party plays a role here too, right? Splitting the Democratic vote and paving the way for Taylor's victory.
That's right. The Free Soil Party, by siphoning off votes that might have otherwise gone to the Democratic candidate, really helped tip the scales in Taylor's favor.
Wow.
It's a sign of, the growing power of the anti-slavery movement, even if it wasn't yet strong enough to elect its own candidate.
So Taylor takes office, inheriting a deeply divided nation, and just a year later, we see another attempt to resolve the slavery issue, the Compromise of 1850.
Yes, the Compromise of 1850 was a package of 5 bills passed by Congress in an attempt to diffuse the tensions over slavery.
Right.
It was this complex and controversial compromise with concessions made on both sides.
And the episode really dives into the details of the compromise, highlighting both its achievements and its shortcomings. What struck you was particularly important about how this compromise is portrayed.
Yeah, it seems like the Compromise of 1850, they tried to appease everyone but ended up satisfying no one. And the episode points out that the Fugitive Slave Act, which was strengthened as part of this compromise, was especially controversial.
Oh, it really was. This act made it so much easier for slave owners to recapture runaway slaves, even in free states.
Right.
And it forced citizens to assist in those captures, essentially making them complicit in upholding slavery.
The episode shares the story of James Hamlet, a free black man living in New York City,
Right.
who's arrested and sent back to slavery under this act.
Yeah.
And his story, really highlights the human cost of this legislation.
It does.
What are your thoughts on how this case is used to illustrate the impact of the Fugitive Slave Act? I think it's such a powerful example of how this law just ripped families apart and created this climate of fear among Black Americans. Even those living in free states, imagine, the terror of being seized from your home, your work, your family,
Yeah.
based on the mere accusation of being a runaway slave with little chance to defend yourself.
It's a stark reminder that, freedom for many Black Americans at this time was a very fragile and precarious thing.
Exactly. And while Hamlet's story has a somewhat happy ending,
Yeah.
the Black community in New York raised money to buy his freedom.
Wow.
But it really underscores the deep injustices of the Fugitive Slave Act and how it intensified the debate over slavery.
So here we are, manifest destiny, pushing the nation westward. The issue of slavery, ripping it apart at the seams, and the Compromise of 1850 failing to hold it all together.
Yeah.
It feels like we're on this collision course with disaster. Where does Andrew Jackson fit into all of this?
Yeah.
I mean, he's been dead for a few years now, but his legacy is still looming large.
That's such an important question, and the episode really grapples with Jackson's legacy, and I think it does a great job of presenting a balanced view. He's this complex figure, a man of contradictions.
It strikes me that Jackson, in many ways embodies this era of American history.
Hmm.
He's this, forceful, larger-than-life figure who champions expansionism and democracy, but he's also a product of his time,
Yeah.
a slave owner who benefited from the very system that's now tearing the nation apart.
That's a great point, and I think the episode challenges us to consider how we reconcile these different aspects of his legacy.
Right.
Do we celebrate his achievements while acknowledging his flaws?
Right.
Do we judge him by the standards of his time or by our own?
Right.
These are questions we still grapple with today, not just with Jackson, but with many historical figures.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and facts.
Yep.
It's about understanding the complexities of human nature and the choices people make within the context of their time.
Absolutely, and it's about recognizing that history is an ongoing conversation,
Yeah.
a process of constantly reevaluating the past and its impact on the present.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
Manifest Destiny, westward expansion, the tragedy of the Donner Party, the craziness of the Bear Flag Revolt, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Compromise of 1850, and of course, the long shadow of Andrew Jackson. It's a lot to process.
It really is, but I think it's important to kind of step back and consider the broader themes that connect these seemingly disparate events.
Yeah.
We see this interplay of ambition, idealism, greed, and fear all shaping the course of American history.
And we see how these forces collide in ways that have these lasting consequences, not just for the people who live through these events, but for generations to come.
Right. The legacy of Manifest Destiny in particular is something we're still grappling with today. How do we reconcile westward expansion with the dispossession of Native Americans?
Right.
How do we come to terms with the fact that this expansion was fueled in part by the institution of slavery?
Those are tough questions. But they're questions we need to ask ourselves if we want to truly understand this period and its impact on our nation.
And I think that's where the value of this podcast episode really shines through.
Yeah.
It doesn't shy away from these difficult questions. It encourages us to engage with the complexities of history, to recognize the human stories behind the grand narratives, and to draw our own conclusions.
So to our listener out there, we encourage you to reflect on what resonated with you in this deep dive.
Yeah.
What surprised you, what challenged your assumptions, what new questions did it spark? History is an ongoing conversation, and your perspective is a valuable part of that conversation. Thanks for joining us as we explored this crucial chapter in American history.